Welcome to the first of two review videos for Exam 3. This first video is going to cover chapters 10 and 11. There's going to be 16 total questions out of chapters 10 and 11, 8 questions each. Away to the races we go. So we started off by talking about how in a lot of the small businesses you work for, there is no separation between the ownership and the managerial control because the owner's in the business every day. Sometimes as businesses grow, the ownership hires more professional managers or hires professional managers, general managers to run the business. But even here, there isn't a huge separation between the ownership and control. And this introduces the idea of the agency relationship, which is how do I make sure that the hired managers take care of my best interests. This slide talks about what principals tend to fear about how their agents may be bad managers. This slide brings up the issue that there are two principal solutions to this idea of agency. The first is you monitor what the manager does, and the second is that you align their interests through compensation. There are specifically two questions on the exam about managerial compensation and aligning of the interest. The textbook has great material on this, so you're going to want to pay particular attention to that issue. And then in public companies where, if you remember my fancy slide where the ownership broke up and there's a lot of unconcentrated ownership, where you now have a great separation between ownership and managerial control. This is where the board of directors comes in and they're the agents. We talked about the idea of Aubrey McClendon, who was criticized for being one of the excessive CEOs in his compensation and his perks and the like. That story, if you recall that story, it will help you answer one of the questions on the exam. And then we looked at the major tasks for the board of directors and who is an inside director, who is an outside director, whether they're related or not, and the basic question of should the CEO also be the chairman of the board. You're going to see this topic is going to come up later, and remember that the reality is that the research doesn't show, even though it makes sense that it should help your performance when you separate the CEO and the chairman, the research doesn't show right now that it really does make a big performance difference. And then finally, the idea of external control, and this is where principally CEOs are worried about somebody else coming in and buying their company through a hostile takeover because they beat the company's performance down so low that it's cheap to do so. Not in the book, but we also talked about the fact that regulators, the press, and business analysts can also be a form of third-party control. This slide talks about the various actions that CEOs and boards sometimes engage in to try to make it harder to take over a company. And there is one question that will come off of this material. Remember that I excerpted out specifically the pages where you have to read in detail about Japan and China and Germany's governance. But I did talk in class about which stakeholders privileged. And in the US model, it's really the stockholder, the stock owner that is privileged. If you look to the German model, here you see in their corporate governance that they favor a lot, they have some things in it that favor more of the employees. In Japan, it's not as clear about who's favored because so much of it is consensus driven, and they haven't had a lot of aggressive in terms of activist investors. And in China, it's still the government that is privileged because if you go astray of them, that's going to be a problem. But we also wanted to remember this idea of stewardship theory. That's the contrary to agency theory, which simply says, what if I just hire a CEO and a top management team that's motivated to do a good job? And again, no specific test questions out of these pages. I've talked about everything that you need. Now on to organizational structures. You in particular are going to want to make sure you know the strengths and weaknesses of each for the exam. So in the functional relationship, some of the advantages are it tends to be cost efficient. It tends to allow development of deep expertise because people live in the functional realms. But it has a couple of weaknesses, namely, a lot of times information does not flow between these entities as well as it should, particularly not at the lower levels. and the president is the only one, or the CEO is the only one that really has profit and loss responsibility. In terms of business strategies, it can work for cost leadership or differentiation strategy. It's more frequently associated or more frequently used with a cost leadership strategy. But if you're going where you really need a lot of R&D to make a differentiation strategy work, then that also, it could be wise to be in a functional mode. But again, it's most commonly associated with cost leadership. Then you get in this idea of the divisional structure, and the textbook does a nice job of developing the different types. But remember, some general advantages of having a divisional organization is that you now have multiple entities where you can push down the profit and loss responsibilities. So this builds additional accountability into the system. Now, in the cooperative form, there's still an attempt, as you see by these lines, to achieve a lot of integration. This is where firms are trying to cover or trying to develop the economies of scope. When you move to the SBU form, the divisions are more independent. And this really makes this person very responsible for the profit and loss. The downside here can be that there is a lot of cost that's put in because you have multiple marketing managers across the different divisions, and there may not be the sharing of critical information. In other words, does the R&D manager in Division A get access to the discoveries in Division B and Division C? Lastly, you have the competitive form, and this is where the divisions stand on their own, and really what corporate does is it sets performance goals for each, and these fellas and ladies are on their own, and if they don't make it, they're out. The matrix is the Goldilocks approach, where we try to get the advantages of both. So in this case, it's structured where you have functional heads here, and then you have projects that span those functional heads to try to solve this problem of a lack of communication below the top levels. You could have it the other way around, where you could have divisions with functional cross-cutting devices as well. So this is an attempt to try to solve the problems of each. The biggest problem that it induces is multiple bosses for these people in the middle, and that can blur the lines of accountability, and that becomes a problem. You're going to want to look at the various global options, or when I say global, I should say international, these three, and typically what organizational forms fit those. And remember, we watched a great video by Anne Mulcahy. If you did not see that video in class, or you want a reminder, just Google Anne Mulcahy and then Columbia Business School, and you'll find the four videos that she did. So those are the review for the 16 questions that you'll need out of chapters 10 and 11.